VJ Edgecombe may not have led the Bahamas to an Olympic bid this summer, but the 18-year-old Baylor commit certainly put the college basketball world on notice.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Monday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your co-hosts. I'm Andy Patton. Him over there in the Xavier shirt is Isaac Schade. And we are with you here every single day, all off season long. The show is not just here from November through March. We are here 5 days a week on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. I want to thank all of you who make this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in our Discord channel. If you want to join the Discord channel, it is free to do so. There is a link in the show notes on both audio and video platforms. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code Locked On College, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. It is Baylor Bears Day today on Locked On College Basketball. We're starting the conversation about VJ Edgecombe and the strong performance he had for the Bahamas in the Olympic qualifiers. They did get eliminated, but we'll talk about what he showed in that series. We're also going to talk about the rest of Scott Drew's roster, some newcomers from the ACC, some other newcomers joining the roster in the freshman group. We're going to talk about that and then close out the show talking about how we think this team might do in a very loaded, very crowded Big 12. This team's a little undersized, but they have a lot of excitement on the roster. We're going to kind of talk about how we think that might shake out in that conference this season. But Isaac, we start with the freshman phenom, number 4 ranked player in the incoming 2024 recruiting class, a very loaded incoming class of talent, by the way. This is the 4th ranked player who would quite likely have been the 1st ranked player in the most recent 2023 recruiting class. He's an extremely talented kid, and he got an opportunity to represent his home country, the Bahamas, in the Olympic qualifiers. They were eliminated by Spain on Sunday, unfortunately, so they will not continue to go on. But as an 18-year-old, playing against primarily professional athletes in these Olympic qualifying tournaments, also playing with professional athletes, Portland Trailblazers center DeAndre Ayton and Buddy Hield were both on this roster. Like, they have legitimate NBA talent on this roster. And Edgecombe went out there and averaged 16.5 points a game. He looked frequently like the best player on this roster. He was grabbing rebounds. He was dishing assists. He had some high flying dunks. He had a really clutch 3-point shot against Poland to eliminate them. Like, this kid looked really, really good in the Bahamas tournament. And we've seen Scott Drew he's just churning out one and done guard talent. Like I put in the notes here, it's like he's just renewing one and done guards like he's getting his tabs done at the DMV. Like, he's just every year he's got a new guard coming in, whether it's Keontae George, whether it's Jacoby Walter, and VJ Edgecombe. Honestly, Isaac, I think he might be the best of the bunch here.
Dude, I mean, Andy, I read somewhere, it was probably last week sometime while I was ignoring fireworks, that like VJ Edgecombe probably would have been the number 1 overall pick this year, like, which speaks both to this draft class, but also how legitimately good he is. And I mean, that's wild to think about. You just mentioned those past 2 guys, and Keontae George and Jacoby Walter. I mean, they've been absolute dudes, Andy. We loved watching them play. I remember us watching Jacoby Walter right out of the gate in Baylor's first game and just being really, really impressed. But here comes VJ Edgecombe, and Andy, legitimately, like, unless he just crumples under the pressure, which I don't think he's going to do because of what we've just seen in these Olympic qualifiers, he's going to be something very, very special for Baylor. And what I love about it, and obviously we'll get to this in a little bit, is he's proven in this moment, playing alongside guys like Hield and Ayton, that he can do it with veterans, which is a great thing because Baylor has brought in some veteran players who have both been to the Final Four in Jeremy Roach and Norchad Omier, right? And so it's like he both will not be, those moments won't be too big for him, but also I think he's somebody that is going to recognize that experience and learn underneath it. And that is a big win for this team.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is we saw Keontae George ball out prior to his freshman season at Baylor. I think it was in a FIBA tournament. I'm actually struggling to remember exactly what the context was, but I remember he made a bunch of headlines before he even stepped foot on the court in a Baylor uniform. And then he, of course, had a fantastic season, gets picked in the lottery. Jacoby Walter has a really strong start to his freshman season. He was a little bit less consistent once they got into Big 12 play, but still found himself picked in the top 20 of this most recent draft here. And what stands out to me is there's a lot of attention that goes to Scott Drew for his ability to land high-profile guards in the transfer portal, and that's something he's been extremely successful at. But in the last couple of years, what he's done is he has very smartly paired veteran experienced guards with his freshman guards in the backcourt. You look a couple of years ago, it was Adam Flagler, LJ Cryer, and Keontae George. Two veteran guys, a senior in Flagler, a junior in Cryer, and then the freshman in George. And then last year they bring in Ray J. Dennis from Toledo, a guy who hadn't played at the high major level, but was a veteran, experienced, established point guard to play alongside Jacoby Walter, and it worked great. And now this year, again, arguably the best combo, the best tandem that you're going to get out of that group. It's hard to beat that three-headed monster of Flagler, Cryer, and George, but this year Edgecombe, who I think is probably he's certainly the highest ranked of these three freshmen, at least in terms of where he was ranked coming into his class. And I think this class is arguably stronger than both of the last two classes. So for him to be ranked fourth in this recruiting class is a testament to how he's being perceived. And then you get to pair him alongside Jeremy Roach, an all ACC point guard, the guy who's run the show for Duke for the last couple of years. Like that tandem of veteran experience, of reliability, of consistency in Jeremy Roach, a facilitator, and this just raw, tantalizing, extremely high upside in Edgecombe, like this backcourt has the potential to be scary good. And what's so great about it is the floor is also really high. Like it's not like it's not Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper at Rutgers where it's like, yeah, the ceiling is insane, but the floor is, it's a little bit harder to predict. They're two freshmen. The floor here is really still pretty high because you have somebody in Roach. So it's a scary proposition that Scott Drew has had so much success the last couple of years pairing this veteran guard with this younger guard. And this year, the folks in college basketball somehow let him land an all ACC point guard in Jeremy Roach and this extremely tantalizing prospect in VJ Edgecombe. It's hard to imagine how much better of a situation Scott Drew could have found himself with these two guards.
And part of it is not only obviously Scott Drew knows how to handle this elite level talent. Like for some people who maybe, missed the Keontae George of it, the Jacoby Walter and Yves Misi of it last year, right? Like, no, Baylor is getting this level of talent. This is a consistent thing. So Scott Drew knows how to handle it. Now, a lot of it was our guy, Coach Alvin Brooks, was the one bringing in a lot of that talent and recruiting it, but Scott Drew knows how to handle it. The other thing, to just go a little further with Roach, Andy, is you mentioned him running things for Duke the past couple of years. My goodness, if anybody knows how to work with elite level freshmen coming in, it's somebody from either Kentucky or Duke. And Jeremy Roach, who, obviously we'll talk more, but is in his fifth year of college basketball, has seen his fair share of elite one and done talent. Thank you very much. And knows how to bring them along, knows how to talk them through the ups and downs of your freshman year, knows how to help them navigate all of that, navigate high level basketball at the college level. And so both on and off the court, Edgecombe is going to have people around him to help continue to lead and guide the way. And so, Andy, I know everyone is very excited about Cooper Flagg. I think I'm a little more excited about Edgecombe, just in terms of which freshman I'm most excited about, just from like an electricity standpoint, right? Like I am absolutely excited to see Cooper Flagg, and I think he's a great talent. And you did a great job talking about him last week, by the way. It was that Thursday show. But just in terms of like basketball excitement, man, I cannot wait to watch Baylor, and hopefully they'll have their camera angles figured out a little better this year. Andy, Edgecombe is one of 6 newcomers for Scott Drew's team this upcoming season, 3 freshmen, 3 transfers. How is Baylor's lineup and rotation going to shake out? That's where Andy and I are headed next, and we'll get there in just a second. Right after I tell you about Game Time. Going to MLB games in the summer is hands down one of my favorite all-time things. The game, the food, the atmosphere, everything that's part of that experience. And I'm excited to make all new experiences at the ballpark this summer. But thankfully, if you want to do that, you don't have to sweat last-minute high-priced tickets. Why? Because Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball that makes getting these tickets faster and easier. In fact, prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer you get to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Andy, a week from today is the Home Run Derby. I can't wait. I kind of look forward to that more than the actual All-Star game itself. We were looking up tickets before this. $145 is the cheapest ticket. That gets you into Section 231. But the best deal they have right now, $303 each, just behind home plate, Section 113, row 8. Folks, go check that out if you want to go to the Home Run Derby a week from today. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. We're going to move now from talking specifically VJ Edgecombe, the dynamic freshman coming into Waco, Texas, to talking about the fullness of Scott Drew's roster for this year. That does include, Andy, as we said in the teaser for this, 3 incoming freshmen, 3 incoming transfers, and then the rest of the roster rounded out by returning players. Now, as is pretty typical in this day and age, we see schools not using all 13 scholarships. It very well seems that that's going to be the case for Scott Drew's club right now, that as best we can tell, have 10 scholarships utilized right now. There's 11 people on their roster, one of which is a walk-on, and so we'll see how that goes. Andy, before we get into the specifics of these players, does this feel about the right number of players and the right combination of returners, freshmen, and transfers to you?
Yeah, we had a conversation, I guess a couple of weeks now, with Evan Miyakawa from the fantastic website that he's built, evanmia.com, and he did an extensive amount of research on kind of the best way to build a roster in modern college basketball. And there's 3 keys, and one of them was having good players, which check. For Baylor, that's pretty obvious that they have that. Number 2 was 50% of your returning minutes or returning players. You want to have like 50+% from returners. And I feel like Baylor's probably right around that. They didn't get quite as many opportunities because they had a couple of one and done guys last year. Obviously, Walter and Misi both gone. They had a couple other guys who hit the transfer portal. And then they had a few guys who just ran out of eligibility, like Chama Chachua. I think Jalen Bridges was finally out of eligibility. So they didn't, I think they're probably a little below. I actually didn't check the number ahead of time, but they have some veteran guys coming in the transfer portal, some young, exciting players coming in as freshmen. Of course, we talked about Edgecombe, and then they have enough key returners. Like we'll talk about their projected starting lineup, but I believe that 2 of their 5 starters will be returners who played significant roles last year. And the majority of guys coming off the bench, I think, are going to be guys who are returning to this roster as well. It's maybe not as many minutes or overall production returning as you might like, but you can't fault Scott Drew for churning out one and done talent. I mean, it's just one of those things that happens, and you got to find a way to replace those guys.
Well, and 2 of the other 5 projected starters, while not returning minutes for Baylor, good grief, bring in are 2 of the most experienced players in the country who, once again, as we've said, are both Final Four participants previously. So, Andy, let's go there, look at the transfers. We've already mentioned Jeremy Roach at length coming in from Duke. He's got 1 year of eligibility, has been an honorable mention All-ACC player, a third-team All-ACC player. Last year at Duke, 14 points, 3.3 assists, 2.5 boards, 1.1 steals. Career high 42.9% from 3 on 3.5 attempts a game, basically, and shot just shy of 85% from the free throw line. Andy, we've talked about Roach as he regards to how he will help Edgecombe. But let's not forget, he is a terrific basketball player in his own right. What do you think Jeremy Roach's experience and talent brings to this roster?
Yeah, I was surprised to see Roach enter the transfer portal at all, but we saw a lot of turnover at Duke. They obviously have that tremendous freshman class coming in. And for Roach, I think he gets a challenge in the Big 12. He gets to compete against just a different style of basketball, a little bit more physicality that he might face in this conference. But I think he's going to be able to bring that outside shooting. He's going to be a facilitator. Again, high-level guard play around him with Edgecombe. I think he can kind of help a bit of a mentorship role, a bit of a just kind of a yin and yang with the style that those two guys play. It'll be really interesting to see how kind of offensively, how they're attacking. Are they spacing the floor a lot? Are they, is there a lot of dribble penetration? Are they pounding the ball down low? Like what exactly that's going to look like? But they have two guards who are absolute hellraisers with the basketball in their hands. And I think that that's going to make life really difficult for opposing defenses. And another one of the players they brought in is a guy who's going to really help them space the floor in a significant way. And that's Jalen Celestine, who comes in from Cal, guy who shot 44% from three last year on about 4 attempts per game. He didn't do a ton else at Cal. He spent 4 years there. He had a medical redshirt year, so we're not sure if he's going to get another year of eligibility after this year. He's a bigger guard, 6'7". I think the website lists him at 6'8", but he's a 3-2-3 hybrid. But he is a gunner. He is a 3-point specialist, and you toss him in the mix with with Edgecombe, with Roach, with some of the other returners that they have on this roster, like with Jaden Dunn, with Langston Love. There's a lot of spacing, a lot of shooting. This is going to be a really, really good offensive team. And not only that, they added a tremendous player in the front court as well.
Yeah, and that's Norchad Omier from Miami. Andy, one of my just favorite players in college basketball the past couple of years. This will be his 5th year, 2 years at Arkansas State. The past 2 at Miami. Is an undersized 5, but that's what he's played at Miami. He was their center, second team All ACC 2 years ago. Excuse me, third team last year. Just balled out last year, despite Miami not having much team success. 17 points a game, 10 boards, 35% from 3 on 2.2 attempts per game. That number was way up in terms of attempts. So I'm curious to see how that plays this year at Baylor. But Andy, one of my favorite things about Omier, has averaged a double-double all 4 years of college. That's going to happen again at Baylor, despite being undersized.
Insane to average a double-double. I don't care that 2 of those years were at Arkansas State. I don't. To be able to do that for 4 consecutive years, to do it twice in the ACC is absurd levels of productivity for any player. And for him to be able to have done that the way he did, if he does it again at Baylor, that's absolutely incredible. And I think the size is something, and I know we're going to talk about this, the kind of the pros and cons of this roster, and certainly size is something I want to discuss more. But Omier is absolutely a center. He is absolutely capable of being your team's big man because of the rebounding prowess. You don't average 10 plus rebounds a game for 4 straight years without being able to play a true traditional center position. But trying to look at a projected lineup and a rotation for Baylor is a little bit interesting because Omier's an undersized 5, and I think they're going to play an undersized 4 as well. I think looking at their lineup, we were kind of trying to project it before we hit the record button here. And we settled on 4 starting positions pretty quickly. Omier's going to start at the 5. Jeremy Roach is going to start at point guard. VJ Edgecombe is going to start at the 2. Jaden Dunn's going to start at the 3. I think we feel pretty confident about all of those things. Omier and Roach are obviously 5th-year veteran transfers. Edgecombe is incredibly exciting prospect. Jaden Dunn started all 35 games last year, so that's not going to change. But that 4th or that 5th spot is interesting. And we've seen some projections that have that 5th and final starting spot going to Langston Love. Langston Love averaged 11 points a game last year for Baylor. He's a veteran guy. He's familiar with the system, but he's about 6'5". So if you're starting Omier at the 5 at a 6'7" center, and you're starting Langston Love as a 6'5" power forward, are you starting Jaden Dunn at the 4 and Love playing the 3? Like, how is that going to work? Like, it's a really, really small lineup. They have some guys off the bench who could contribute. They have Josh Ajonwuna, who's about 6'10", so he could certainly start at the 4 or the 5, and he played about 15 minutes a game last year, averaged about 5 points, 3.5 boards. So certainly a player who's likely going to step into a bigger role for Baylor, regardless of whether he starts or not. But he's the only player on this roster that's listed at being above 6'9", the only one on the roster who is that size. It's hard for me to imagine that that's going to not cause at least some level of problems for them at some point this season. But the overall rotation with him, you add the other freshmen in, Rob Wright and Jason Asemota, who are both top 50 prospects in this upcoming class. You have Celestine, like we mentioned, from Cal. this is a really dang good team. I'm just curious if that size is going to be a problem for them.
Yeah, and that's a very curious thing. I'm with you on Love. Let's remember, he was their stud sixth man last year, and unfortunately was hurt in the back end of the season, didn't get to play much, and so he's going to be champing at the bit to get back out there. And I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, you look at this, as you were saying, it's like the roster tells you what's going to happen, right? Like if we don't got a bunch of big dudes, we're not playing a bunch of big dudes. We're going to go small. And Scott Drew obviously can and will do that. That won't shock me at all. Very excited to see this team, Andy. Going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I think what we want to do now is talk about what is this going to look like in the Big 12, because the Big 12 is absolutely stacked. Can Baylor compete with Kansas and Houston and Iowa State and Arizona and the other teams in this conference? And we're going to get into all of that in just a second. All right, folks, continuing our conversation here about Scott Drew and the Baylor Bears. We talked about VJ Edgecombe and his dynamic, exciting performance representing Bahamas in the Olympic qualifiers. We talked about the rest of this roster, the newcomers in Norchad, Omier, and Jeremy Roach, what they bring to this team, how it's going to look from a lineup and rotation perspective. But what we want to do now is talk about where this team slots into the Big 12 conference, because it's no surprise that this conference is absolutely loaded heading into next season. You have a Kansas team that is expected to be probably going to be the preseason number one at the majority of outlets. I think we're already starting to see that, and barring some surprise roster changes in the next couple of months, I think Kansas is probably your preseason number one. Houston is often listed as a preseason number two, or at least a preseason top five team. I think Alabama is probably one of the only non-Big 12 schools that's locked into being a top five team this next season. But Houston has a lot of great returners. They have some fun new guys coming in. Terrence Arsenault is going to be healthy. That's going to be huge for them. Iowa State retains basically everybody from last year's roster. They bring in Joshua Jefferson from St. Mary's, who I think is just a perfect TJ Otzelberger type player. Really nice fit for that Cyclones roster. And then you have Arizona, who's got far more turnover than these other rosters had in terms of losing players. Keshad Johnson's gone, Pella Larson's gone, Umar Ballo transfers, Kylan Boswell transfers, but they have a ton of great players coming into the program as well. Anthony Del Orso and Trey Townsend are two of the best mid-major transfers in the entire country. Toby Awaka comes over from Tennessee. They got some high-profile freshmen, including Carter Bryant, coming in as well. I know ESPN has listed all of these five Big 12 schools in the top 9 of their rankings. So this is a stacked, loaded conference. And Baylor is right in the mix there. And I think you could slot them anywhere from 2 to 5. And I think if you wanted to make a strong argument for them at 1, I think you reasonably could. If you told me right now that Baylor wins the Big 12 next year, that's not going to stun me. Not the way it would stun me if you told me that about, say, West Virginia. Sorry, they're going to catch a stray here, but like Baylor is capable of winning this conference. They're also capable of finishing 5th in this conference, and the spread between 1st and 5th just doesn't feel all that big. We talked already, and we can get into it a little bit more, but the biggest issue I have with Baylor's roster right now is size. It's as simple as that. Norchad Omier is a fantastic center. He is elite. He is excellent, but there's not a ton of depth behind him, and he's only 6'7". You say, okay, I think Omier can capably guard Hunter Dickinson. Fine. Who guards KJ Adams? Like in that example, and you look at Iowa State, they have a lot of size as well. Houston has always got a lot of size. Like this is a conference with a lot of size and a lot of talent in the front court, and Baylor is a great offensive team, and I think they're gonna put Hunter Dickinson on skates. Like they're gonna challenge him defensively, and they're gonna score a whole bunch of points. But are they good enough defensively? Are they good enough physically to be able to compete with these teams night in and night out? I think that's a reasonable question to have about this roster at this point.
Yep, absolutely, Andy. And I think you're spot on with what you calculated there about the defense. Is that we've seen Norchad Omier be able to neutralize bigger centers. For example, in the ACC the last couple of years, the only other person to average double-doubles is Armando Bacot from North Carolina. Omier has held him in check every time just about that they've met. So I'm not concerned about him being able to do that with a Hunter Dickinson or other big guys around the Big 12. But then it becomes the question of how do they do it the 4 slot? Scott Drew is going to have to scheme this to be able to work to where it's like, can what we're doing offensively or can the nuances of our defense be good enough, be sly enough, be slick enough, whatever it is, that we're just getting enough of an edge there, or that our edge is so overwhelming at, say, 1 through 3 that I don't care that you have an edge at the 4. We're going to counterman that by what we're doing in the rest of the backcourt. And frankly, Andy, I don't know that we'll have the answer right away. I think there's going to be some tinkering. I think we're going to have to find, because keep in mind, we've got some changeover in the assistant coaches as well, as we talked about. That's going to come into play and factor as well with it. And Andy, we've seen some fluctuation in Baylor's defensive rankings the past couple of years. Last year, finished 72nd at KenPom. The year before that, 107th at KenPom. Andy, I remember we railed on them that season. But the 3 years before that, Baylor's defense finished 4th, 22nd. That was the championship season, and 13th. Which Baylor defense are we going to get? Because that championship season, it wasn't like they were rolling out a whole bunch of really massive dudes, right? They were undersized, but just had guards who could clamp you down. And unfortunately, Andy, you remember that all too well. I hate to bring up, but that's true. And so I'm very curious to see how they scheme this thing to maybe hide some of those size deficiencies.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting because I think offensively, this team is going to be really difficult to defend because of their ability to space the floor. If Langston Love is truly your starting 4, this is a dude who shot 48% from 3 last year on 3 attempts per game. Like this dude can really, really shoot it. You add Celestine from Cal, like we said, he shot 44% on 4 3-point attempts per game. Nunn's a fantastic scorer, and Roach and Edgecombe, I think, have the ability to.
Omier's at least a threat out there.
Yeah, Omier can space it out if you absolutely need him to, and you have to defend him out there if he's out there. And you have your 2 guards who, I mean, Roach and Edgecombe, I think, are both going to be able to shoot it. Roach has shown that ability, but they're also great at penetrating. And if you create a situation where the floor is completely spaced out, those guys are just going to be able to get to the rim consistently. And I think that's going to create, I mean, I think this has the potential to be a top 10, top 5 offense in the country next year. Unquestionably, they have the potential to be that, but you can't, I mean, Scott Drew can't continue to put together top 5 offenses and borderline top 75 defenses if they want to actually make it to the national championship game. Like they can continue to do that and finish top 3 in the Big 12 and get a 3 seed or a 4 seed and make the Sweet 16. But the defense is going to eventually catch up to them. And I think looking at this roster, there are schematic things they can probably do to create a great defense. But we talk about that team that won it all in 2021 and the elite defense they had. They had a guy in Davion Mitchell who looks like an all-NBA caliber defender. That's how good he was defensively in college. And they had, I mean, a guy who ended up being a tight end in the NFL because he was so strong and just like well-balanced. They don't have that level of defensive talent on this roster. If I'm proven wrong, great. If VJ Edgecombe can be like a all Big 12 caliber defender or all defensive player of the year candidate, awesome. That's huge for them, but that's not what he's been billed as up to this point. Roach does not have that size and length to be that kind of defender. Again, maybe there's some guys on this roster that'll prove me wrong. Maybe guys like Nunn and Love can really get out there and defend on the perimeter and wreak havoc in ways that we haven't necessarily seen them do in the past, but they've both been a part of these 2 teams that haven't finished in the top 70 defensively. So if they are elite perimeter defenders, that hasn't been the case up to this point. So I like this Baylor roster. I think they're going to be one of the most fun teams in the country to watch. I'm with you in saying Edgecombe is the freshman I am most excited to watch this upcoming season, even over Cooper Flagg. But I am concerned about this team's defensive abilities to the point where I think it curbs the potential ceiling for this roster.
Yeah. And Andy, it's you've also got some teams in the Big 12 that are potentially capable of neutralizing the offense. You think about Houston and Iowa State, for example. So going to be really interesting there. And Andy, I think one of the funny things that we've thought about, and I know we don't really have time to get into it, but it's just a thought experiment that folks you can do on your own time. What would this team have turned out to be if Scott Drew had left for Lexington? Right, if he wasn't sitting in that Mexican restaurant that day, trolling us all in that way, like I don't think VJ Edgecombe would be here. I don't, like certainly Omier and Roach wouldn't have come. Who would be the head coach? Like that's just been an interesting butterfly effect thought process for me. But Andy, ultimately, I'm with you. I'm very excited about the leadership that Roach and Omier bring to this team, although they're newcomers, but they're the types of guys who will be able to fit in with a Nunn and a Love and the experience that's already there as well. And then you got to imagine that those guys are both motivated. Yes, I mentioned that they'd been to a Final Four, both of them in their career. But let's remember, Miami was bad last year. Let's remember, Duke was not, didn't end up having the finish that they wanted or the regular season that they wanted. And that Jeremy Roach is going to be uber motivated. We talked about it earlier with Langston Love coming off of his injury and how he's going to be wanting to go. So I think this is going to be a hungry Baylor team as well, Andy. And, Scott Drew deciding to stay, right? Like they're just all these motivations. It's going to be a fun year in Waco, I think, Andy, and we'll be excited to see it. All right, folks, happy Monday. It's been great to be together. Hopefully you're enjoying some NBA Summer League, watching all of our favorite college basketball stars that are off to the league, getting after it. It's just getting kicked up right now, and that's a lot of fun. We're going to have another great week of shows. Make sure you stay dialed in and locked in with us. If you're not subscribed to the show already on audio and video, make sure you do that. If you're not part of the Locked On College Basketball Discord, we'd love to have you come join us there. The link's in the show notes, and it's free to be a part of. As always, apologies to the lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats, and until tomorrow, peace.